In early October 1888, the chokecherry bushes scattered across Pine Hollow Basin were starting to lose their leaves. On his initial ascent of the eastern slope, Thaddeus Mercer carried no axe, neither stone implements nor logs for a cabin. In his arms were 2 rolls of unprocessed wool, still oily from lanolin. A mule followed behind, transporting dry pinyon pine and juniper that had been felled in summer and stored for bitter winter. His 10-year-old daughter, Evelyn Mercer, came behind him carrying a coil of hemp rope. Their hound, Ranger, paused at the entrance to Black Cave. Down in the valley, no one grasped it, at least not yet. The origin of Thaddeus Mercer's peculiar choice went back to the previous winter. At age 41, after 11 winters spent trapping and guiding across the Wyoming Territory, he was intimately familiar with ice and snow. He also understood that most frontier households simply took drafty, freezing cabins for granted. Winters all followed the same pattern: additional chinking, extra firewood, and beds scooted nearer to the stove. Men would rise before daybreak to add another log to the flames. For years, Thaddeus had repeated the same routine in the cabin he had built single-handedly. The construction itself was sound, but then the prolonged cold spell arrived. During the prior winter, the chinking contracted, letting breezes seep through the walls. Dampness collected on the inside face of the logs and trickled down onto the packed earth floor. Come January, Clara Mercer developed a cough. A fever followed, prompting Thaddeus to burn additional firewood. He draped blankets over the walls and hauled the bed nearer to the stove. Still, the warmer the interior grew, the more condensation gathered on the icy logs. By the end of February, Clara was too weak to even sit up. Once she passed, 3 tin cups stayed on the shelf, yet each morning before Evelyn stirred, only 2 were filled. Without a word, Thaddeus rotated the handle of Clara's cup to face the wall, ensuring his daughter wouldn't accidentally grab it. He never openly faulted the cabin. From that point forward, however, he started to take note of details he'd previously overlooked: fine snow sneaking in under the door, and floors draining warmth from boots and blankets. The chimney was funneling precious heat up into the open air. He recalled the odor of wet timber. He remembered stoking the stove all night long and still catching sight of Evelyn's breath misting in the morning light. Winter had already claimed one of his loved ones. He was determined not to give it another opportunity. He wasn't chasing an odd notion. He simply refused to stick with an approach that had proven disastrous for his family. One night, he pulled out an outdated trapper's journal and scribbled 3 words at the top of an empty leaf: wood, wind, damp. To conquer all 3, he would have to abandon the entire cabin mindset. The solution wasn't supplied by any carpenter, it surfaced from a recollection. Thaddeus Mercer first thought of the cave in spring 1888, while inspecting his trap routes high above Pine Hollow Basin. As an unseasonable snowstorm swept over the ridgetops, visibility vanished. Gusts sent biting snow crystals slashing through the pines. Thaddeus and Ranger huddled inside a modest hollow in the rock and bided their time. Over 3 hours went by in the open. Inside the cave, a delicate skin of ice coated the water in his tin cup. The air was chilly, yet remarkably steady. At the time, he hardly gave it any thought. Following Clara's death, the memory resurfaced in late August. That afternoon, he carried a small spirit thermometer up the slope and placed it deep within the cave. Down in the basin, the temperature sat at 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Deep in the cave, it registered 46 degrees. When he stepped outside just before sunrise the next morning, the mercury had plunged to 34 degrees. Inside, the thermometer still hovered close to 46 degrees. The cave generated no heat of its own. It simply declined to shift as quickly as the world beyond its walls. On 3 sides, the place was enclosed by sandstone and granite, with masses of rock overhead leaning into the hill, stabilized by the steady temperatures far underground. Thaddeus wasn't familiar with the phrase thermal mass, but that knowledge wasn't necessary. He recognized a spot where the onset of winter would be delayed. Moving to the farthest wall, he placed his palm on the rock. The chill felt unlike the wind outdoors, not biting or harsh, but patient. By late September, Thaddeus Mercer's choice was finalized. The cabin wasn't going to be deserted. It would continue to fulfill its role. Big meals would be prepared there, equipment kept in storage, and animal hides cleaned and dressed under its roof. Everything requiring natural light would stay in the cabin, but when the bitter chill set in, he and Evelyn would bed down inside the cave. He had no intention of warming 18 feet of rock like one would heat a summer cottage. The approach was more straightforward. Maintain the shelter at a temperature above freezing, minimize air currents, preserve dry bedding, and consume less fuel. From those objectives, everything else would follow. Across a number of nights, he broke the challenge into 5 components. Incoming cold air at the opening needed to be limited, and stagnant air had to be captured with wool. Heat had to be positioned far within so the surrounding rock could take it in. Sleeping arrangements, people, and fuel all needed to be kept off the cold earth. The firewood had to remain dry from the season's first snow all the way to spring. There was no one big innovation, just a series of small choices functioning in concert. One afternoon, as she organized their provisions, Evelyn glanced at the cave and asked whether they intended to dwell there as animals would. Thaddeus paused briefly to think over her question. He then explained that they were merely having the hillside take on some of the tasks the cabin couldn't manage. That response appeared to satisfy her. She went back to separating portions of unprocessed wool into different stacks. Thaddeus had deliberately collected unwashed fleeces laden with lanolin. His years on snow-covered trapping routes had instilled a brutal lesson about survival. Cotton soaked through was fatal, whereas untreated wool repelled moisture and retained heat even when wet. He'd witnessed sheep make it through storms that killed cattle on their feet. Those lanolin-coated wool fleeces struck him as more than mere bedding. They formed a barrier to the wind. Certain panels remained suitable for sewing into hanging drapes. Others required repairs. Several were too worn and would be turned into filler. None of the scheme was written down. No sketches, no dimensions tacked to any surface. It existed solely in the sequence of supplies hauled up the incline later that night. Evelyn came upon a red-striped blanket that Clara had made years before, and for a few moments she clutched it in silence. Thaddeus glanced at the blanket, then at the heap of wool destined to become curtains. He didn't pick up the scissors. Rather, he neatly folded the blanket and placed it off to the side. That item wasn't meant for the shelter. It was intended for Evelyn's bedding. The first to observe the continuous flow of materials heading up the hillside was Silas Boone, the closest cattleman in Pine Hollow Basin. Silas had a no-nonsense nature. He didn't mock Thaddeus as he carried wool, timber, and firewood to the cave. He just posed a query. Did he plan to keep firewood there, or maybe use it as a cold storage spot for meat in the winter? Thaddeus shook his head and said he meant to sleep there once the severe chill hit. Silas's gaze moved to Evelyn, then returned to the black mouth in the hillside. He quickly identified 2 issues. Rock can trap dampness, and a poorly positioned stovepipe can asphyxiate a household well before freezing temperatures ever do. Thaddeus conceded without objection. A few days afterward, Silas brought up the discussion near the hitching posts outside the trading store. One of the listeners was Caleb Rourke, a freight driver recognized across the area. Caleb wasn't unintelligent. He knew about climate, about campsites, and about the consequences of winter when it struck down rash choices. That was precisely the reason his words carried weight. A cave serves for riding out a storm, Caleb noted. It's not the place to bring up a kid for an entire winter. Several men laughed quietly. No one brought up preventing Thaddeus from proceeding, and nobody labeled him careless. Most arrived at another interpretation. They figured sorrow had muddled his thinking following Clara's passing. Maybe he just wanted to get away from the house. The initial doubt came not as animosity, but as compassion. That afternoon, while fastening a pack next to his mule, Thaddeus caught snatches of the exchange. As Caleb spoke about the little one, Thaddeus didn't turn or offer any justification. Yet the fingers gripping the lead rope tensed briefly before loosening once more. Prior to hanging a single wool drape or hauling in a stove, he concentrated on the cave itself. No refuge would safeguard anyone if it gave out before winter fully set in. He began at the top, using a long lodgepole pine pole. He tapped the sandstone overhead and listened carefully. Solid areas returned a crisp ring, while loose sections made a hollow sound. Anything doubtful was pried down immediately, rather than left hanging above a sleeping child. The floor then demanded its turn. The cave floor gently declined toward the entrance, but two shallow dips trapped water. After a rain, Thaddeus cut a narrow drain channel leading toward the cave mouth. He then covered the walking surface with gravel and flat stones brought from the hillside. Next came the wind check. Short strands of wool were tied close to the entrance, so they could move freely. The opening faced southeast, so most northern winds missed it, but gusts eddying around the ridge still sucked air in unpredictable directions. Deeper inside, a weak trickle of water seeped from a crack in the rock. It wasn't much. A single cup might take several hours to fill. Still, Thaddeus scooped out a larger basin below it, lined it with a shallow tin pan, and added a wooden cover. If the cave kept a steady temperature, that water might stay useful even in deep cold. Evelyn, meanwhile, gathered fist-sized stones for the future sleeping platform. Ranger examined every nook of the cave, then circled twice and curled up along the south wall. That location was the driest and the least affected by moving air. Thaddeus took note without saying anything. Evelyn called it their corner of the home. For the first time, Thaddeus viewed the cave not as a shelter, but as a room. The entry was wider than necessary, and if left alone, every change in breeze would drive a fresh gust of cold air inside. Deep in the cave, he wouldn't allow that. Using stripped lodgepole pine poles, he put up a simple frame across the mouth. He didn't seal the cave with a massive wall. Instead, he made a narrow vestibule almost 4 feet deep and low enough for a grown man to duck. The result looked unusual. That was exactly the idea. A smaller opening reduced the air volume passing in and out. The vestibule provided a buffer between the outdoors and the living space beyond. More significantly, the two openings were staggered. The outer entrance sat slightly right, the inner opening slightly left. The wind could no longer travel straight through the shelter. The spaces between the poles were filled with dry grass, clay, and scraps of waste wool. A layer of canvas treated with linseed oil and fine ash covered the outside. One afternoon, Caleb Rourke rode below the ridge and looked up at the unusual construction. A few days earlier, he'd commented that it looked like Thaddeus was building a sheep pen on the mountainside. Silas might have laughed, but this time he stayed quiet. The offset doorway caught his gaze. It obviously wasn't accidental. As evening winds rushed over the hillside, Thaddeus placed a candle in the living area and watched the flame from outside. The gusts roared through the pines, yet the candle barely moved. Evelyn came through the vestibule, paused, then smiled. Evelyn said the wind didn't bite her ears in there anymore. Thaddeus just nodded and tied off one final knot inside the vestibule. He then hung 2 heavy wool curtains about 5 inches apart. The outer curtain was made of coarse wool scraps stitched together, but the inner layer was denser and softer. A layer of still air was trapped between the curtains, and that trapped air did the real insulating. The first test seemed promising. One night, the temperature outside dropped to 19 degrees. By dawn, the cave remained above 43 degrees, without a single fire being lit. Then Thaddeus noticed a problem. The bottom edge of the outer curtain had frozen to the stone floor. Moisture from boots, melting snow, and warm air had accumulated in the wool fibers. That water had frozen solid during the night, causing a small but dangerous issue. If the curtain tore, the barrier would fail. If it stayed frozen, the entrance could be hard to open when it mattered most. Thaddeus took the curtain down at once. He cut 3 inches off the bottom, installed a raised wooden threshold, and made a narrow drainage groove beneath the doorway. A strip of soft leather was secured along the lower edge to block drafts while staying clear of the stone. The curtain was still dry the next morning. Evelyn looked at the repaired opening and asked whether the cave itself had failed. Thaddeus shook his head, saying it had only shown them what needed to be fixed. That was the difference between finding a problem in October and discovering it in January. The stove, taken from an abandoned assay cabin several miles away, was small and bore the scars of years of use inside. Some cracked soapstone plates remained within parts of the firebox. Though flawed, they served their purpose. The typical settler would have put the stove near the door, yet Thaddeus chose the reverse. He positioned it far back in the cave, close to the rear wall, well apart from where they slept. After rising vertically, the stovepipe went through an aperture strengthened with iron sheets, rock, and clay. A basic damper let him reduce airflow while avoiding smoke buildup inside. The initial test ran close to 2 hours, and the outcome seemed promising, with heat rising steadily across the whole cave. Come morning, a fresh issue surfaced. A delicate layer of water lay on the rock just behind the stove. Chilly stone, heated air, and trapped dampness combined into condensation. Left untreated, bedding would get wet, metal would corrode, and mold would eventually show up. Thaddeus wasted no time in extinguishing the fire. He moved the stove 7 inches further from the wall and piled a rough granite barrier behind it, leaving small openings near the bottom and sides. That way, air could flow up behind the heated rock rather than getting sealed into a damp pocket. As he labored, Evelyn used old rags to wipe the wall dry. The following trial turned out differently. The rock kept its heat, yet no moisture formed as Thaddeus examined the dry surface. It brought to mind those damp logs in the cabin the winter Clara passed away. The contrast was clear. Now the trouble had been caught before Evelyn ever had to rest near it. 16 inches off the stone floor sat the sleeping platform. Its construction used pine logs for the frame, with narrow slats laid across the top. On top of that went dried grass, a couple of woolen layers, and lastly, Clara's red-striped blanket, which she had woven long ago. Underneath the platform's foot, Ranger had his own spot. The warmth from the stove and bedding stayed pleasant, without turning oppressive. At the opposite side of the cave, Thaddeus put together an elevated wood rack attached to stone anchors. The firewood lay 14 inches above the floor, with spaced rows that permitted ventilation. For several days, he stored a portion of juniper by the entrance for ease. That error became evident fast. Within only 3 days of damp snowfall, every door opening let moisture flood inside. The outermost logs drank it in, turned heavy, and gave off heavy smoke. The third failure. Right away, he shifted the entire wood rack 6 feet deeper underground. Firewood was laid in slimmer stacks for better circulation. Meanwhile, only a modest amount, enough for 1 day, remained beside the stove. By early November, the spring water basin was fitted with a wooden lid. That allowed father and daughter to collect clean water without venturing into the bitter cold. The cave had transformed from merely a hillside opening with a stove tucked in. By one evening, Evelyn, it had genuinely evolved into a winter survival setup. She laid her mother's blanket out on the sleeping platform and methodically pressed out a fold. Ranger set his head on the bed's edge, while Thaddeus silently looked the other way, feigning interest in the wood rack. Prior to making the cave a permanent residence, Thaddeus devoted a few weeks to trials. Each experiment was recorded in a ledger. Outdoor temp, indoor temp, wood burned, no other details. One night, the outside temperature fell to 14 degrees. Inside started at 45 and rose to 58 inches under 2 hours of fire. Half a day after the fire had died to gray ash, the thermometer was still at 50. He ran all kinds of checks, varying door, open durations, watching air currents in changing winds, sometimes using a smaller blaze, sometimes a larger one. His aim was the least fire required, not the greatest achievable. The past winter, Evelyn had slept in the cave during these tests. She used to wake whenever the flames went out, yet here she drowsed until Ranger mounted the platform and nudged her one morning. Thaddeus realized she hadn't coughed. That observation never made it into the ledger. Rather, he noted outside 12, inside 49, fire out 5 hours. These were the quantifiable values. The deeper significance stayed off the page. At sunrise, he stopped by the platform and placed the back of his hand in front of Evelyn's mouth. She was breathing evenly. Word about Evelyn staying in the cave got around. News traveled fast through Pine Hollow Basin, and by the start of winter, just about every person had caught some telling of it. The comment heard most often surfaced during a group barn roof fix. Caleb Rourke made it as he passed shingles down from a ladder. "A cave is a spot for those awaiting rescue," he remarked, "not somewhere a man would call home for his family." Those words landed heavily, and a few workers paused to consider them. The worry was valid. Thaddeus wasn't just experimenting with his own life. A young girl was residing in that refuge. Concerns ranged from dampness to creosote collecting within the stovepipe. Several people thought sorrow had driven Thaddeus from the cabin, as each corner there brought back memories of Clara. Silas Boone took in the talk without coming to the cave's defense or promising success. His only comment was that Thaddeus had examined more components of that dwelling than most people ever had on their own houses. Caleb gave a nod. The rest gets tested by winter. Nobody disputed it, since Thaddeus hadn't been there during the discussion. Afterwards, a person recounted the entire conversation to him, yet he didn't get upset. Rather, he went back to the cave and examined the stovepipe once more, removing soot and testing the damper. After that, he remeasured the gap between the stove and the sleeping area. The valley's skepticism didn't alter his objective. It only made him more eager to find another flaw. That night, Caleb's remarks echoed in his head as Evelyn, sitting near the fire, repaired a tiny rip in a glove. He observed her for a little while, then grabbed a lantern and checked the chimney a third time. For the initial 3 weeks of November, the basin experienced mild winter conditions. Smoke curled steadily out of the cabin chimneys, and the stacks of firewood remained tall. People began to suspect Thaddeus had labored over a non-existent issue, but he disregarded them and kept perfecting the arrangement by putting up a curtain to block drafts in the entryway. He sealed the top of the stovepipe and kept a charcoal tally of logs on the rock. Everything worked perfectly. The stone conserved warmth, and the water basin stayed ice-free. Evelyn started viewing the cave as an actual living space, placing her reader and rag doll into little wall alcoves. However, ease leads to overconfidence. Thaddeus understood that early November meant little, and the weather had yet to pass judgment. Thus, as the households down below enjoyed cozy nights, he silently carried additional logs up the slope, each trip reducing the need to venture out. When the storm arrived that afternoon, Evelyn put her doll aside and announced that caves weren't just for beasts anymore. Thaddeus looked toward the northern hills. He remarked that the worst was still to come and kept preparing. The initial sign wasn't snowfall, it was the wind's disappearance. For a full 2 days, an eerie calm hung over Pine Hollow Basin. Chimney smoke formed thin gray pillars, went up, then halted beneath a canopy of yellowish-gray clouds. Afternoon sunlight appeared dull, and shadows were barely visible. Ranger sensed the shift ahead of almost everyone. The dogs started retreating from the entrance sooner than normal, frequently standing with ears pricked toward the north and refusing to stay out very long. Over on the far side, Silas Boone noticed his cows clustered in protected areas. Despite the absence of a sharp temperature drop, he moved spare hay into the barn. Meanwhile, to the north, Caleb Rourke had just finished a hauling trip, and what he told people made many uneasy. Overnight, tiny ponds had frozen all the way through, and wagon wheels made odd cracking noises on the icy earth. A bigger force was heading south. Thaddeus took a thermometer reading on the night of November 18th, 8 degrees by the following morning, and -9 within a day and a half. It fell to -24, and then the wind hit forceful, frigid, and unyielding. Dry snow blew across the basin, slipping into cracks rain had never touched. The cabins groaned, barn doors shook, and stovepipes howled. Nature offered no response to Caleb and no protection to Thaddeus. Instead, it started testing every dwelling against an identical measure. Once the thermometer went beneath 0, Thaddeus made one last trip to the cabin, taking Clara's tin mug off the shelf, tucking it carefully into a wood chest, and shutting the lid. Leaving before dusk enveloped the basin, he, Evelyn, and Ranger set out with their remaining provisions, heading for the cave. The true trial had started, and the first attack occurred that initial night of the freeze. Gusts pounded the slope, with dry snow burying the entryway and spiraling near the door, hunting for a way inside. The outside wool hanging flapped non-stop, but the inner one stayed almost motionless. The staggered corridor functioned precisely as intended. Thaddeus fueled the fire with both pinyon, pine, and juniper. The pinyon caught right away, while the juniper burned at a slower pace, producing a thicker layer of embers. Warmth seeped into the soapstone slabs and the granite barrier situated behind the stove. Outside, mercury dropped to -24, yet the sleeping space maintained a reading close to 53. For hours on end, the wind kept testing, and the cave responded with gradual shifts. Just before sunrise, the flames had died down to radiant embers under gray ash, yet the platform thermometer still showed 47 degrees. Under Clara's red-striped coverlet, Evelyn dozed, while Ranger curled up below the bed, snout hidden under his tail. The lid-covered water container had a thin coating of ice at its edge, but the water itself was still unfrozen. Down in the valley, the cabin revealed a contrasting scenario. A bucket of water near the wall had turned solid. Delicate white streaks of snow showed up under the door and along chunks of chinking. Come morning, Thaddeus descended to examine the previous dwelling. The signs were unmistakable. Both cold and dampness had made their way inside. Collecting the leftover bags of dried provisions, he hauled them to the cave. The initial day didn't demonstrate that the shelter could endure an Arctic season. Over the full winter, a smaller truth emerged. Moving Evelyn before the cold arrived wasn't premature. It was exactly on time. Later, when he returned, Thaddeus found the cave quiet, Evelyn still asleep. Ranger stood with a single paw resting on the platform's rim. Neither of them moved as he came in. He said nothing, simply opened the stove and placed a lone juniper branch on the embers. The freezing weather didn't break. After just a few days, it persisted for over 3 straight weeks. The mercury seldom rose above freezing. Each new gust pushed fine snow further into the flaws of typical cabins. Households that had been snug in early November saw their fuel supply dwindle much quicker than anticipated. Piles of logs kept against outside walls soaked up dampness from the snowdrifts. The wood continued to burn, though poorly, giving off heavy smoke and far less warmth. To keep the same warmth, ever more wood went into the stove. Creosote built up inside the chimneys. A cabin at the basin's southern rim caught a chimney fire, and the occupants doused it with snow just before the roof caught light. Yet the battered flue pipe stayed in use for the remainder of the season. Over at Silas Boone's home, frost started appearing around the tips of the north-facing logs. The chill reached further in than normal. He drew his children nearer to the heat source and began doling out firewood daily instead of weekly. Caleb Rourke, however, still had a bigger stockpile than most homesteaders. Nonetheless, winter found a way in. A fierce wind wrenched one of his barn doors, and blowing snow piled onto the outer part of the cordwood. His planning wasn't inadequate. The weather was simply exceeding normal limits. In the valley below, stacks of fuel diminished quickly. Folks gave up on thermometers and turned to the calendar, anxiously asking how much longer the cold would hold. The sole exception was perched far up the slope within the cavern. Thaddeus stuck to his usual pattern. Because the rock held its warmth, one armful of timber could burn for 4 to 6 hours. The tally marks in charcoal rose along the wall without pause, yet at a pace much slower than Thaddeus had anticipated. One night, Silas Boone looked first at his shrinking pile of firewood, then at his kids, who were trembling under thick quilts beside the stove. At last, his mind wandered to October, those cartloads of seasoned timber, the wool, and the silent fellow who had hauled them up the mountain while everyone else readied for an ordinary season. Then, in late December, a fresh storm slammed into Pine Hollow Basin. It was even fiercer. For 5 full days, the roots linking the farms all but disappeared. The gale tore snow from exposed fields and flung it onto ridges, fences, and structures until the drifts resembled solid barriers. By day 2, the mercury plunged to about -33, and the nights went colder still. Inside the cavern, Thaddeus, Evelyn, and Ranger stayed put. The stove prepared their meals, and their water came from the sheltered basin. Seasoned logs rested on the shelves, and the arrangement deep in the burrow kept functioning. But on the 3rd morning, Ranger acted unlike himself. Rather than lying under the platform, the dog moved into the entryway. He came back, then gently clawed at the wall beside the stovepipe. Thaddeus turned his gaze to the stove. Something seemed off. The flames were sluggish. Outwardly, the airflow had dropped, with snowdrifts building ever more around the air inlet and the chimney. The refuge was gradually suffocating. He acted without delay, tying a rope around his middle and giving the other end to Evelyn. He told her to remain indoors and keep a firm grip. Then he crept through the entryway and out into the blinding tempest. The wind struck with a physical force, wiping out all sight. Being just a few steps from the door, already felt perilous. Guided almost as much by feel as by vision, Thaddeus employed a stubby spade to cut a new ventilation path on the drift's protected side. He set a slanted board to limit future buildup and checked the chimney cap for ice and compacted snow. Each motion demanded real exertion. Every instant outdoors drained warmth from him. Eventually, he headed back to the cavern, and as he came out through the entry, frost covered his beard and brow. Ice clung to his sleeves. Evelyn remained calm. She pulled off his mittens at once and set them near the stove. Next, she examined Ranger, and in a short while the stove regained its proper draw. The fire grew strong once more, and the air current resumed, for then the peril was gone. The takeaway was obvious. The cave had guarded them effectively. The wool, the rock, and the wood burner each performed their role, yet not one of those alone could safeguard a household. A dwelling, much like any living being, required oxygen, and every design would eventually discover a fresh manner of breakdown. True endurance meant detecting a threat while it could still be fixed. As Thaddeus struggled against the weather, Evelyn had wound the lifeline around her wrist rather than merely gripping it. When he came back at last, vivid red grooves were still visible on her wrist. She had held on the entire time. Then, on day 4 of the tempest, the gale slackened for a few treasured hours. Silas Boone resolved to visit the cave personally. The ascent proved grueling. In spots, the snow came up to his chest, while the thermometer in a wooden case by the cave's mouth read -31. At the threshold, Silas ducked and squeezed through the slim opening. A curtain grazed one shoulder. Then a second, the shift was instant, subtle yet undeniable. The stove wasn't the first thing that drew his eye. Evelyn was seated on the platform with her legs crossed, absorbed in a book, her mittens absent. Ranger dozed at her feet, and not a wisp of condensation hung in the air. Only afterward did Silas glance at the stove. Thaddeus said the flames had died to gray cinders hours before, with no new fuel added for close to 6 hours. The thermometer still showed 54 degrees, even though it hung close to the sleeping platform. Rising, Silas examined the shelter just as he might examine a barn, a fence line, or a stock pen. The granite behind the stove felt warm when his hand rested on it. Farther back in the cave, the wood rack remained, with every single log still dry. Inside the covered basin, the water stayed liquid. The curtain's lower edge hung loose, free from ice or stiffened cloth. The wall behind the stove also stayed completely dry. Weeks before, the predictions had included dampness, smoke issues, stiff curtains, wet fuel, and bad airflow, but Silas saw none of those problems. Praising others wasn't in his character. He simply posed a single query. How much firewood? Thaddeus gestured to the charcoal marks on a section of rock, then passed the ledger over. Silas looked at both carefully. The figures spoke for themselves. Almost an hour went by before Silas got up to go, heading down the snowy incline. He stopped and glanced behind him. The small, half-buried entryway appeared rough, yet he now grasped precisely what labor lay underneath. His gaze shifted to Etten Kane, stopping on the red-striped coverlet. For a brief instant, Clara came to mind. The two men stayed silent until Silas asked the one question left, worth asking. When she wakes, is she cold? Thaddeus looked toward his daughter. A page flipped over, and Ranger stirred in his sleep. No. Silas gave a single nod. Heading back to the basin, he brought along not only evidence but also a transformed perspective. Once the storm let go of Pine Hollow Basin, Silas Boone started evaluating the figures. The analysis stretched across weeks, not days. Ledger records, stacks of wood, temperature measurements, basic data spanning early November to late January. Thaddeus Mercer consumed under 1 cord of mixed pinyon and juniper. Silas had burned close to 2.5 cords. Various bigger families burned over 3 cords, running their fires nearly non-stop. The thermometer logs showed the same pattern. In the deepest cold spell, with outside temperatures near -37 degrees, the coldest reading in the cave's sleeping zone was 45. That number was recorded after the fire had been extinguished for several hours. That very night, a corner in Silas's place sat at around 30 degrees, even with a stove burning. There was no one explanation for the difference. The surrounding rock dampened temperature fluctuations. The entryway and off-center opening cut down on the power of incoming drafts, while wool layers preserved trapped pockets of unmoving air. The elevated bed area kept sleeping gear off the chilly ground, and careful firewood storage maintained dry fuel. Heat generated at the shelter's core gradually seeped into the adjacent stone. Equally crucial, minor issues were identified and fixed before the cold season could magnify them. At the trading post one afternoon, Caleb Rourke overheard a group talking about the data. There was no need for exaggeration, and nobody added any. Following a long silence, Caleb noted that even a fine cave needed a suitable slope. Silas responded at once. A fine cabin also needs proper architecture. Several heads nodded, and the discussion shifted. No one offered apologies, and no one looked for them. The important thing was that the conversation had moved on. Earlier, people doubted the cave's viability. Now they examined the reasons behind its success. Nature's judgment was clear, confirmed in each stack of wood, each ledger page, and each temperature entry. One night, with snow dropping silently outdoors, Evelyn asked whether they could remain in the cave until the basin at last melted free. Thaddeus studied the rock walls. Neither the storms nor the freezing weather had defeated it. They had just taken advantage of the mountain's fortitude. "We'll remain," he said, "until the mountain no longer has to shelter us." Evelyn went back to her reading, while Ranger dozed under the sleeping platform close to the stove. One more charcoal line was added to the stone, and another note was placed in the ledger. Spring came late to Pine Hollow Basin, with snow clinging to sheltered ravines well after the lower terrain had started to melt. Movement slowly became simpler, and something else accompanied that shift. Construction habits began to change. The first to act was Silas Boone. What he took from the cave never turned into a lecture or public statement. Rather, it showed up in boards, nails, and many extended afternoons spent working. Every bit of his firewood sat on a platform raised 12 inches off the ground, running along his cabin's north wall. Before the next winter, a secondary wall went up, set apart from the original by a thin slot of air. A little entryway was built in front of his door, making cold drafts alter course before they entered the main room. Other households introduced more modest tweaks. One family draped wool blankets over the wall facing the wind. Another moved its stove nearer to a brick or stone arrangement that retained heat far longer than open air. Across the basin, these small tricks gradually passed from home to home. No one referred to them as cave concepts. They functioned without issue. Caleb Rourke never brought up again what he'd said the prior winter. Still, by late summer, the comment about caves being spots where folks awaited rescue had quietly faded away. Traders observed an odd pattern. Caleb bought extra wool batting, additional sheet metal, and a larger quantity of lime mortar than usual. In the weeks that followed, he sealed his cabin anew, installed a second inner door, and reconstructed the shelter for his firewood. The actions said plenty. There was no formal apology, and by the time October reached Pine Hollow, none was required. All across the basin, cabins now had elements that previously were found solely on a rocky hillside overlooking the settlement. Those elements included ventilation spaces, entryways, elevated firewood racks, and better sealing against the elements. Practical know-how had traveled the way it usually does in frontier country via outcomes rather than word of mouth. Thaddeus Mercer, for his part, didn't much care about being proven correct. When autumn arrived, he was at the cave again with Evelyn. The canvas had thinned under wintry gusts. He swapped in new canvas, checked every binding, scrubbed the stovepipe, and dug leaves and dirt from the drainage channel. Once more, they started preparing, since the coming winter was indifferent to past events. One day Silas appeared on horseback, a bundle of wool batting tucked under his arm. At the cave mouth, he passed it to Thaddeus. "Got plenty this year," he said. Nothing more. Thaddeus took the roll, weighed it briefly, then split it into 2 even portions. He gave 1/2 back to Silas. The rancher eyed the returned bundle and offered a slight smile, though neither said a word about why. For many winters to come, the meaning was clear between them. Thaddeus kept using the cave and making small improvements to it. No book was ever written by him, nor any patent recorded. All he left was an aged ledger, marks made with charcoal on rock, and one plain fact: a harsh winter ignores status and viewpoints. It gives way only to rock, wool, dry timber, and watchful care. Most important, Evelyn stayed alive and well, and that settled every debate for Thaddeus. Looking back on the fierce winter of 1888, what stayed with him most wasn't the blizzards but the spring morning that came after. Light streamed into the opening, and Evelyn took the 2 tin cups out, placing them on a sunny flat stone to warm. Inside the chest, the 3rd cup remained untouched. He'd avoided even glancing at it for months. Yet when he lifted the lid that day, the urge to look aside was gone. The grief was still there, but the blame had lifted at last. Behind him, Evelyn giggled at something Ranger did. The laugh moved through the cave as snow melted, while outside, runoff seeped down the slope. The mountain had held up its end, and the child he'd brought into that refuge had lived to welcome spring.